Cool. My name's Stewart. I'm head of research and development for Empirical Spirits. And today I'm going to talk through the... No, you can't hear? No? Can we... No one can hear. Yeah, you can hear? It's okay? No? Un poco más? Gracias. Okay. Better? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk through about Empirical and kind of what we do for people who don't know what we do, and then I'm going to, in the second half of my talk, I'm going to focus in on upcycling and circularity and how we deal with that within different aspects of our processes, basically. So. There we go. Okay, we've got to go the other way. So as I've said, Empirical, we call ourselves a flavor company because we originally called ourselves Empirical Spirits, but as time went on, we realized that we were focusing on flavor from the ground up and we were no longer making spirits. As we developed, we ended up working into cans and then into a section that we call provisions, which is primarily our food-based sector. So as I said, we build flavor from the ground up, and this is a great example. So this guy here is me, and the guy in the middle is actually, he's a farmer in Denmark in an area called Thy, and he is a fifth generation dairy farmer, but 2 generations ago, he changed and began growing a lot more grain. So he grows all our oats and some different grains that we need, but he actually started malting grains because he realized that there was only 2 malteries in Denmark, and they both were just doing mass produced, nothing specialty, they couldn't dial it in. So him and his brother-in-law built a maltery themselves, and this was the end of last summer. Me and the guy in the black shirt is Rodrigo, who's our chief production officer. I didn't see that, sorry. Who went to visit him. And so it's just like a good example of how from the very beginning, which is the grain that comes in, we're working directly with farmers and trying to achieve the flavors that we need at every single step of the way. And one of the first things that happens with the second part of our grain is about 60% of our spirits are based off koji. Which koji is a fungus, which is primarily, people would know it from, it's used to make sake, it's used to make soshu, it's used to make soy sauce, and we, as a distillery, use it for its enzymatic activity, and also for its flavor. So this is actually our koji room, where this is pearled barley, which is barley which has had the hull removed, which we then inoculate with spores, and the koji grows on, and then we use that in our brewing process. So it adds this kind of layer of umami as well with this subtle kind of mushroom floral kind of note, which later in our process we use in several different ways. This is our brewery. There was a video here. I had videos to go through as well. I'm sorry that technical difficulties they couldn't play. But we brew everything ourselves, every step of the way. Everything is done within our facility in one little warehouse in the shipping area of Copenhagen. So this is our brew system, and if you look here, this thing on the top that looks like several plates, that's actually a mash filter. So we filter all of our wash, because as it comes through, it's because of the koji, because because of the way we mill it, you're left with a porridge like mash. So we can't ferment on the grain, so we filter it this way. So we're left with a lot of spent grain. So the spent grain that's what the video was about to show, was which would have been here. But the video was the spent grain coming out. And this is the first step of the first byproduct that we are showing in our production that you will see that we upcycle later, as we'll come to it. This is our distillery. All of our wash gets fermented in the brewery, then distilled here. We distill everything under vacuum, and all of our stills are purpose-built. So we built everything from scratch, from odds and ends, and because we distill under vacuum, everything's distilled at a much lower temperature. We distill in the areas of between around 8 degrees up until around 35 is as high as we go. So because we distill at a much lower temperature with certain botanicals, we have the availability to isolate and capture certain aromas, such as when you're distilling wash that has koji in it, you can kind of look out and capture those fruitier, more floral notes. This is a quote that I just absolutely love. It's from Matt Orlando. I don't know if anyone knows Matt Orlando, but he's the head chef of an owner of a mass restaurant in Copenhagen, and his ethos is there is no such thing as a byproduct, only another product. And I love this approach, and it's something that has always stuck with me, and it's something that we also look at Empirical, which is what we're going to go into from now. So this is the first part. So as you've seen, I kind of skipped through our production very quickly because I'm sure most people here have seen a million distillery walkthroughs and stuff, and it's not that interesting. So that's why I'm kind of skipping through to get to just what I kind of want to talk about. So we're using spent grains. So we're left with tons and tons of spent grain every week, and it's how can we use that? They still have a lot of starches left in it, a lot of sugars. There's many uses for that, and if you look across the world, people are starting to get very intuitive ways of dealing with this. So I'm going to talk through a couple of the different ways that we have started dealing with our own spent grain, because it's a huge thing for distilleries in particular, that you're left with a shit ton of spent grain that is super flavorful. And because we do different grain bills for each different spirit, for example, one of them is koji and malt. Another one is malt and purple wheat. So depending on the grain bill, depends on what we will do with it. So this is the first thing. So this is the spent grain that comes out here. From the filter, it just looks like a mush of porridge. But the photo in the background is actually, it's a farm that is about 40 minutes outside of Copenhagen. So this farm, they keep pigs and chickens. And they come and they pick up whatever spent grain we don't use for other things, and they feed the chickens with it. And then they also take our pasilla chili, which I'll get to later, and they feed that to the chickens as well. And it's interesting because depending on the botanical that the farm picks up, the flavor of the egg changes slightly. Not to say that it tastes like that botanical, but you can see a noticeably difference in the structure of the egg. And then by us giving the grain to this farmer, we actually, the distillery staff gets free eggs every week. So we get organic free-range chicken eggs, she gets food for her chickens. It's a pretty good deal. So it's kind of something that I think because of our location as well, we're very lucky to be able to do, because Copenhagen's a pretty small city. So within 40 minutes to an hour of Copenhagen, there is several farms that are open to working in these kind of ways. This was the first into kind of looking at different ways of repurposing. A lot of people here might know shoyu or soy sauce. So we started looking at making an amino sauce of sorts. So we started looking at making a grain-only sauce. So this here is examples of making like a spent grain amino sauce, which the one on the left here was the first trials that I did, which went horrendously wrong. And the one on the right is actually a barrel-aged one, which we currently have a barrel-aged program of amino sauces similar to shoyu or soy sauce, which is aging at the minute. But the interesting thing about this is, because we have such a high content of koji in our base, in our grain bill, there's still a high enzymatic activity after we press it. So we just add salt and water and heat, and then it takes roughly around a year to 2 years, depending on the process, and we have this delicious umami-rich sauce which you can use as a seasoning. So by bringing in the grains in the first process, by doing to this, we have no waste in the process. So every step of the way, we're looking at how we can close that circle and keep everything within the distillery. And the third one is, this is all with the same spent grain. The third one is something that I've recently been working on with a PhD student, who he does like bioarchitecture, so he makes different structures and things out of organic material. So we started looking at our spent grain. I gave him some of our spent grain, and he started to work with it. And then he started to inoculate it with mycelium to see how the mycelium would take to it. We worked out different temperatures, different humidities, and we eventually got the mycelium to grow, which you can see here. So this is about as light as styrofoam, and it's completely just leftover grains from our brewing process and mycelium, and it takes 2 weeks to make. And then the next step that we took was, okay, we might be able to make this into a packaging. And for us, because like we're based in Copenhagen, but we're a global brand. Well, we're a pretty small global brand, to be honest, but we do ship to a lot of countries. Packaging is a huge thing for us, so I've been playing with how we can actually get rid of our packaging and how we can just use what we have in the distillery as packaging. So the next step was actually growing mycelium and our spent grain around the bottle so that would be its packaging. And it worked, which is super nice. This was a very rudimentary example of it, but it did work. So as you can see here, I'm going to go to the other side. Sorry, I'm walking back and forth a lot. I apologize. As you can see here, it breaks into two halves, and then you'd be able to lift the bottle out. And it's interesting. There's been a back and forth with this Adrian, his name is. He's this French PhD student. He's an absolutely lovely guy, and he's amazing at his work. He has came to realize that because we use so much koji in our grain bill, usually if you try and make a mold or anything out of spent grain, you have to sterilize it because you have a lot of different bacteria active. But because we have such a high level of koji, which is a fungus growing, which is still active, it actually prohibits a lot of other yeast or bacteria from taking grip. The easiest example I can give to explain this is that if you're making, say, wine, for example, and you have to, instead of just doing a natural fermentation, when you pitch a yeast into it, that yeast will take over. It's a very similar process. So he can actually cut a full section of the process out, so we don't have to sterilize the grain, and it's much quicker, much faster, and much cheaper to produce packaging in this way, which he's super stoked about. And because of this relationship, he's actually going to include that into his PhD, which is a really cool example of working within your realm. Because this guy actually, he lives roughly, I'm going to say about 500 meters from the distillery, just by chance. This is a super cool project, and next week we're going to have the final prototype that we're going to pitch forward to. Possibly we will move into using this as our packaging. So for example, in the final prototype, we've made these little balls which are going to slot in around it, and then when you receive it, you'd be able to pull the string and it would crack open. You would have your bottle completely intact. This is completely biodegradable, so when you're finished with this, you can just put it in your compost, and that's it, done. So there's no waste, and it's using something that we have an abundance of within the distillery, so we don't have to bring in another product just to ship our product just for someone else to throw it in the bin. It makes no sense. So we're looking into other alternatives and how we can use this, our spent grain, in different manners to unlock the possibilities. So that's why I wanted to start with a spent grain, because you can see 3 distinctly different avenues that we've taken. And this has been in the last 2 years, and I think there's a lot more. This is not something that we're doing, but it's something that I came across in researching, dealing with spent grain. But there's a brewery in Germany that they're making like paper out of their spent grains. And depending on the grain bill of the beer, because you'll have darker grains in it, will determine the color of the paper. So they will have like a Dunkel beer, which is super dark, and they'll have a Pilsner, which is really light paper, which I think is like super interesting and really innovative. So it's looking at a lot of people doing things like this and then trying to branch out and do our own thing as well. So, reusing spent botanicals. As you know, distilleries, when you do botanical spirits, you use a shit ton of botanicals. And most distilleries, if you're making a botanical spirit, once you distill your botanicals, you just throw them away. They go to waste, they're not used, that's the end of it. And most of the time, they're incredibly flavorful still afterwards. They're not great for distillation because you've stripped out that certain flavor profile that you want, but there probably is a second use that you can find. So, moving into this. So I'm going to use one of our spirits, which is called Ayuk, which is it's a spirit based off Pasilla Mije, which is it's a chili which is growing in the Sierra Norte Valley in Oaxaca, in Mexico. And Lars came across this chili about 3 years ago in the central market in Oaxaca, and he brought back 20 kilos in his suitcase and handed me the 20 kilos and was like, we're going to make a product out of this. And I opened the bag, it was wrapped in like black bags, and I was like, fuck me, this is amazing. And this is what the chili looks like. And then we started to look into how we can get the chili, and we got another person in the company involved who's called Eunice, who's an absolute amazing guy. He deals with a lot of business development and also like procurement of things and business relationships. And we started looking into how we can get this chili, and it turned out that the price difference from what the farmers got paid to what you pay in Europe is fucking astronomical. It's a disaster. So we just went to Mexico, spoke to the farmers, and was like, we need this amount of chili. This is what it is on the market. We will pay you this. What it is in Europe. So there's no middleman. We'll deal with the shipping and you'll get paid a fair price. So they were like, yep, that suits us. We get paid more, you get a good product, suits everyone. Perfect. So, but when you enter into these kind of relationships, it takes a lot of building, a lot of time. So for the last 3 years, there's been a lot of back and forth. Lars and Rodrigo and Eunice just got back from Mexico actually. And we end up with a lot of chili because we buy their whole crop. So there was a video here also, but never mind. And this is us distilling the Pasilla Mije chili, which you can see there's a lot of chili left over. And yes, we strip some of the fruitier notes out of the chili, but it's still incredibly flavorsome. It still has that smoke. It still has a lot of those flavors. So this is Eric, he works in R&D with me, and he started developing different hot sauces out of this chili. And from this, he was able to devise a product which uses all of the spent chili that comes out of our distillation. So when it comes out, we lacto ferment it for around 3 months, and then there's different things added to it, but we end up with a final product which is now in the market. So all the chili that we buy from Mexico is distilled, and then after that, we make a hot sauce out of it. So once again, we're closing the loop of the botanicals that come into the distillery, and we're eliminating waste from our channel. Raw ingredients is another one. So it's like, okay, when you have to get back to what I mentioned at the start was working directly with farmers, it's a huge part of what my job actually is finding people who we can work with and working with them to develop innovative ways of approaching to make alcohol and flavor. So the first one, this is Eunice, my colleague who's next to me, and this is actually cane sorghum. Cane sorghum is a super interesting plant. Usually doesn't grow in Europe. Predominantly grows in the US or in Africa or in South America. It needs a lot of sun and very little water. But we worked with a seed breeder, and over time we developed a species of sorghum that could grow in Europe. And now we've planted our first field of sorghum in Northern Europe. And this is a regenerative farming plant, so it's a no-till plant. Takes very little water, it's drought resistant, and it's much better for the environment in the long run because of the amount of CO2 that it sequesters into the soil. So this is one avenue that we're looking down, and this was actually a relationship that we built with a seed breeder, which is a very interesting way of looking at farming. The next thing is, this is Rodrigo and Eunice again, and I actually took this photo. This is a super interesting farmer and his dog. I love that farmers always have dogs. They always have lovely dogs. It's the benefit of going to visit them. So I went to visit this farmer because I was looking into aronia berries. Aronia berries grow in Northern Europe and in Canada, and that's basically it. Super interesting berries. They have a very high sugar content, but the reason that they became really popular in the last decade or so is because of their health benefits. They're seen as this superfood. The juice is meant to be brilliant for you. They have all these vitamins and so on. But the issue is once all the berries are harvested, they're processed into juice, they're sterilized, and it's kept at the optimum use for being a health drink. But if they're not processed and they're left to sit, within a matter of months, that will start to diminish, and most of the farmers that are using it for health benefits or health drink purposes, they actually won't use the berries after that. So I started working with this farmer last year, so all his crop, I suppose, that isn't being used, I basically bought it from him, and because once we checked out the sugar levels and the different, just basically the structure of the actual fruit, it's pretty spot on for fermentation and distillation. So we've started making an eau de vie style product based off these aronia berries, which we're going to age in different casks from different parts of Europe. So this is a very unusual fruit to use for eau de vies or brandies or whatever you want to call it. And it's also eliminating a farmer's waste. So instead of him having waste, we can actually upcycle it into our business and create products out of it, which are delicious. And the last one out of this example is this guy here is actually another person who, he grows fruit solely for the seed. So if somebody wants to plant a tree, they go to this man, who also has a lovely dog, and they buy seeds from him. So as you can see here, this is like a slow berry orchard, and slow berries are pretty rare actually to find just in like an orchard setting. Most of the time they grow wild. Even in England, most of it is foraged for. There's a few farms in northern England, but this gentleman, because he was trying to strive to develop different trees for different reasons, has a fuck ton of sloes that he just doesn't use. So I went and met him on a fucking freezing day in Copenhagen, and he's an absolute delight. His sloe berries are absolutely massive. I don't know if you know what sloe berries look like, but they're not the size of a small plum, for sure. But his product is amazing. He's been working with them for so long, and he has ample amounts of this fruit. So, long story short, took a load of the fruit off him, brought it back, and we ended up making a product based on a sloe berry, where we took a drought-resistant plant from Africa called a resurrection plant, macerated that into booze, distilled it, and then we macerated the sloe berries into that and left it in a Bordeaux cask for around 6 months. And we were able to replicate this with a single botanical and a single fruit. This beautiful kind of expression similar to like a classic sloe gin, but without using anything else, just one fruit, one botanical, which is super interesting. Gracias. If anyone has any questions, that's why I like to do it a bit shorter, because people usually have some ridiculous questions about this point. So please feel free to raise your hand and shout a question at me. Anybody? No? We're good? All right, I'm done. Gracias por escuchar.